Once upon a time, there were 3 church members. And Jesus came to them, and to the first, Jesus gave 5 talents, the equivalent of $1.5 million today. To the second, Jesus gave 2 talents, $600,000. And to the third, Jesus gave 1 talent, $300,000. It's interesting that in the Middle Ages, the word talent came to mean what we associate with it, gifts and abilities. And that meaning was taken from this story. So you can think about this story as about money, and that's okay. Or you can think about this story as not just treasure, but talent and time, and that works too. But no matter how you think about it, each of those church members received gifts with extravagant generosity. And here's what's important to note. None of those gifts came with instructions. Jesus is not interested in telling people how to use their gifts. In fact, he trusts that these church members will figure it out. Each has been given gifts according to his own ability. They are not to be burdensome. They are not to create a hardship. And the church members are left with, what in the world do we do with these gifts? Jesus gives them space not only to figure that out, Jesus entrusts them with these gifts, but Jesus gives them the room to determine how they will risk and grow, how they will make mistakes and fail and learn from those mistakes, how they will use their imagination, how they will take chances, and how they will flourish. 2 of those church members do exactly that. The gifts they received were not equal. The return on those gifts were not equal. And yet Jesus' delight and joy in them is equal. Well done, Jesus says to them. You have stepped into my presence. You have stepped into the kingdom of God, God's vision for how creation is to be. The third church member didn't fare so well. The third church member hid his light under a bushel basket, hid his talent in the ground, buried that talent. And the third church member did that because he was afraid. He was so frightened that he decided to play it safe. And he invested his talent in his own security. Jesus goes ballistic in a reaction that to our ears seems pretty much over the top. Now, maybe it's because in this story, Jesus is just days away from death. He has left the security and the safety of the Galilean countryside, and he is on his own high-risk venture in Jerusalem. Jesus is loving passionately and is fully invested in God's vision for God's kingdom. And so perhaps Jesus' reaction has something to do with this desire for security and safety on the part of the third church member that even seems offensive to him in the face of all he is risking. Perhaps Jesus responds in the way that he does because seeking safety and self-protection and following Jesus are 2 mutually exclusive things. But perhaps this reaction that Jesus has is about something else. How many of you have children? How many of you have a child that at some point in time didn't live up to their potential. That at some point in time, you dealt with a child who refused, either out of their fear or laziness, to be all that they were created to be. Anybody here? And were you calm and reasonable as you discussed this with your child? I confess that the times that I have been rather enraged with my kids is when they weren't living up to their potential. Perhaps that explains some of Jesus' reaction to the church member who had one talent. Now, I suspect that most of us think of ourselves as one talent folks. I suspect that most of us are afraid, and that we are seeking safety and security and self-protection, and that we have told ourselves that what we have to offer really isn't much, and that it isn't really important anyway. But in thinking in this way, we have sold ourselves short. We have stunted our growth. And we are not living into our full potential. And I believe that this story tells us that when we sell ourselves short, it frustrates the heck out of our Almighty Father. But I don't believe that God punishes us. I believe that we punish ourselves by the choices that we make. This is the tragedy of timidity. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so when we are so fearful that all we can think about is our own safety, we truly aren't caring about others. We aren't loving passionately. We aren't risking, and we aren't fully investing ourselves. We throw ourselves into the outer darkness of fear. And in God's eyes, that is akin to death. On December 3rd and 4th, we who are members and friends of this church have an opportunity to consider how we will pledge our financial gift in 2012. I would encourage you to prayerfully begin to consider that now, but not just what you will give financially for 2012, but what will you give in terms of time and talent to God through our church as well. There is nothing magical about pledging. All it does is make us intentional about giving off the top, giving our best, rather than giving leftovers of our time and our talent and our treasure. All that we have is a gift from God. Interestingly enough, it doesn't come with instructions. The only mention of guidelines in the Old Testament is to give a tithe on our income, 10%. If we were to give 10% of our time in a 24-hour day, that would be 2.4 hours, or in the 16 hours of wakefulness, give or take, 1.6 hours a day. But the truth is, God trusts us to figure out what to do with the gifts that we've been given, and God gives us space to do that. Space in which we can risk and grow. Space in which we can make mistakes and fail and learn from those mistakes. Space in which to engage our imaginations and take chances and flourish. And the truth is, God doesn't want God's gifts to be burdensome to us. to become a hardship. And so the challenge for you and for me is this. Will we make our decisions based on our fear and our desire for safety? Or are we willing to risk and to invest in God's kingdom vision? And so these are the questions that I would ask you to consider, not just today, but in the days and weeks ahead. Will you commit yourself to gathering in worship on a routine, even weekly basis? Will you commit to grow in your faith through a class or a small group next year? And will you commit to grow in your giving to God through the church next year? Will you go in mission within our church, and will you go in mission to your community in the name of God? And for those of you who are sitting there thinking of yourselves as a one-talent person, feel the hand of Jesus on your shoulder. Hear Jesus' words to you. Do not be afraid. I am with you. Risk a little bit. And if you're already risking a little bit, risk a little bit more. For when you do, God grows you into the person God created you to be. For when you do, God can change the world.